Father, forgive them. They know not what they do.
Hello everyone, it's Mark Goodacre here. Welcome to the NT Pod, the podcast all about the New Testament and Christian origins. It's episode 32, and today we're looking at the Passion narrative in Luke's Gospel. This is the third of our four back-to-back podcasts on the Passion narratives in the Gospels. And when we turn to Luke, we take a decisive turn away from the Passion narratives of Mark and Matthew, because although Luke's Passion narrative has lots and lots of material in common with the Markan and the Matthean Passion narratives, nevertheless it departs at key moments as well. It's much more different from Mark's, on which I think it's dependent, than Matthew's is. Matthew and Mark really are a pair amongst the four in the New Testament. I mean, sometimes in Luke, it's difficult even to make the case that he's depending on Mark, because the rewriting of Mark is so pronounced, and in that he does differ there from Matthew. And there's also quite a lot of fresh material added. Perhaps the most distinctive thing, the thing which is most memorable about Luke's Passion narrative, and the thing which has made the biggest gift to dramatists and passion play writers and film writers, is the story of Herod and the trial before Herod. What happens is, during the trial before Pilate finds out that Jesus is from Galilee, and he says Galilee, and thinks, well, in that case, he's one of Herod's subjects, and so he sends him off to Herod. And there's an interesting historical element here, which is that it's quite plausible that this Herod Antipas, would have been in Jerusalem at this time, at Passover time, just like Pilate would have been. It's a plausible little historical detail. Whether this actually happened is more difficult to determine. In terms of the narrative movement of the Passion narrative, the Herod story doesn't really add anything except to build up the case that you have in a big way in Luke for the innocence of Jesus. And this theme of the innocence of Jesus is absolutely massive in Luke's Passion narrative. I mean, the innocence of Jesus is something that's already there in Mark's Passion narrative, and it's there in Matthew's Passion narrative. But Luke takes it up almost a whole extra notch, so that you have a whole chorus of people saying that Jesus is indeed innocent. Take, for example, the centurion's confession, which we looked at in both Mark 15 and in Matthew 27, where a centurion singular in Mark and centurion with others in Matthew make this confession that Jesus is the Son of God. When you get to Luke's version of this same story, quite interestingly, what happens is the centurion doesn't say that he's the Son of God. He says he is innocent, righteous, dikaios in Greek. He's the righteous one. That's how much Luke wants to stress in his Passion narrative, that Jesus is innocent of any crime that he's charged with. And other elements in Luke's Passion narrative seem to serve this same goal of stressing the innocence of Jesus. Think of the two thieves on the cross with Jesus. In the depiction of the two thieves who were crucified alongside Jesus, it's the Lucan version we always think of. I can remember as a child being in church and hearing the Matthean Passion and the Markan Passion, and there's this little note about how the two robbers that were crucified with Jesus were hurling insults on him. And I remember thinking, well, that's not right. I know that there's another version of the story in which one of the robbers actually makes a sort of sympathetic statement. And of course, what I was thinking of as a child was the Lucan Passion, because what happens in Luke is it's not them both offering insults. One of them does the insults, and the other one declares Jesus' innocence. He says to the other thief, and he is a thief in Luke rather than a robber or a brigand like they are in Matthew and Mark. He says that this man's innocent, and he contrasts it with the crimes that he and the other person that's crucified with him have committed. So it's the centurion at the cross that declares Jesus' innocence. It's one of the people that's crucified with Jesus that declares his innocence. And then through the trial narrative that leads up to the crucifixion, you have the same theme again. Pilate in Luke's Gospel 3 times goes out and says that he doesn't find anything in this man that's worthy of death. Now, this motif in Luke might well serve a kind of apologetic purpose. If you imagine Luke with his very Greek-sounding gospel, writing a gospel for people who would be really troubled by the idea of someone being crucified and would assume that someone who's crucified must somehow be some kind of criminal. Perhaps what Luke is trying to do is make clear that there is nothing to blame in this in Jesus, and so he's really working hard to make sure that none of his kind of elite audience is troubled by the idea that Jesus at the heart of this story is a criminal. And if you think of Acts of the Apostles, Luke's second volume, it's the same kind of theme that you get there. A lot of the time he's trying to make clear that these Christians, these early Christians, don't represent any kind of big political threat to Rome. I don't think it's the main theme in Acts of the Apostles, but I think it's one of the things that's there, and it's there also here in the Passion narrative. And in depicting Jesus' death, one of the things that Luke does is he makes his Jesus very serene in the face of death. Unlike Mark and Matthew that have that very troubling, my God, why have you forsaken me?" in Luke, the words from the cross are somehow more serene. They're more like a kind of martyr's exemplary kind of words. And if you read Stephen's martyrdom in Acts chapter 7, you see the same kind of motifs coming through there. At the beginning of the episode, I played just a very brief clip from Jesus of Nazareth, where Robert Powell has that line from Luke's Gospel, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing." And that's typical of Luke's Passion narrative and the way that Jesus dies, with that kind of serenity of praying for his persecutors. Of course, one of the things that this also provides is a kind of an example of how to behave in this kind of appalling circumstance. And one of the things that you've had earlier on in Luke's Gospel in chapter 6 is that you must pray for your persecutors, and so now Jesus is shown to be fulfilling that commandment that he himself gave to others. And it's a very typical Lucan kind of prayer, beginning with Father, the single word Father. That's the way that Luke even has his Lord's Prayer beginning. So Jesus' prayers from the cross are typically Lucan in that respect as well. And there's one other respect too, where he ends the whole story with, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." And that's a quotation from Psalm 36. It's rather like the way that Mark and Matthew are quoting from Psalm 22 in Jesus's last words from the cross, the my God ones. But Luke has a more kind of serene psalm for Jesus's last words. Now, one of the issues that this brings up in terms of how Jesus comports himself through death is, what exactly is Luke's theology of the cross? Does Luke even have a theology of the cross? It's one of the strange things about Luke's Gospel that if you go searching for lines like "Christ died for our sins," or "the Son of Man died as a ransom for many," the kind of line that you get in other early Christian documents. I mean, it's there in Mark's Gospel, "the Son of Man came as a ransom for many" in Mark 10:45. You can't find them in Luke. It seems really lacking in anything that says that Jesus' death is something that brings about salvation from sin. And so a lot of New Testament scholars have said that Luke lacks that kind of theology of the cross. And of course, in Luke's case, you can test this by looking at Acts of the Apostles and seeing if in Acts of the Apostles there's the same kind of lack of any theology of the cross. And interestingly, when you get to Acts of the Apostles, you find that it's lacking there also in clear statements that Jesus' death on the cross saves people from their sins. I think it's incorrect, though, to say that Luke doesn't have a theology of the cross, because I think his theology of the cross is one which is of a kind of exemplary death, a martyr's death, a prophet's death, the person who dies in a serene way, forgiving his persecutors. And in that, I think he already has an eye towards Acts of the Apostles when he has that in Luke's Gospel, because he's going to have to depict lots of people under persecution in the Acts. And so he's giving you the illustration of how it is that Jesus himself acted in the face of death. So I think it's not true to say he has no theology of the cross. It's more that the emphasis, the stress is on a slightly different point. And when you get to Acts of the Apostles, the key thing seems to be that God has vindicated Jesus through the resurrection. That's the thing which keeps coming through. So it's back to that kind of righteousness, that innocence theme again, that he didn't deserve those things that happened to him. And there may just be a little hint of one of those kind of more traditional theology of the crosses in the Ethiopian eunuch story in Acts of the Apostles, where the Ethiopian eunuch is reading Isaiah 53 and has to have it explained to him by Philip. And that might be something where Luke is imagining a kind of salvation from sin, a rescue from sin through Jesus' death kind of thing. So it may be that Luke is just emphasizing it less than other early Christians, rather than that it's completely absent in his Gospel and Acts. There's an element in Luke's Passion narrative that we shouldn't miss, and we've already begun to touch on it there with mentioning the resurrection, and that's that of the three synoptic Gospels, Luke's Gospel is the one that has the fullest resurrection story. Unlike Mark's brief chapter just dealing with the empty tomb, or Matthew's dealing with the empty tomb and then a little bit extra, Luke takes things to a whole fresh level and has extended appearances, and he has one of the most brilliantly written stories anywhere in the Gospels, the story of the road to Emmaus, where Jesus appears to two people on the road to Emmaus and they only recognize him at the moment when he breaks bread with them. It's a brilliant piece of writing, and it's one of these things which always fascinates me when you see passion films and passion stories, because they really struggle to depict it clearly, because there's that kind of mystical element to it. I might just put in one more plug for the BBC and HBO Passion in this context, because I think that the way the road to Emmaus was done in that was excellent, and it will be a spoiler if I explain how it was done, but suffice to say that it didn't involve what sometimes comes in these things, where Jesus just walks around with a great big hood over his head, and then the people walking with him looking generally mystified. But there's one thing which we should pick up before we finish on Luke's resurrection story, which is a real contrast with Mark and Matthew, and that's that whereas Mark and Matthew really stress that the resurrection appearances took place in Galilee, in Luke he's really keen to say that Jerusalem was the heart of all of this. And in this, he's already preparing for his second volume, where he's going to have the whole gospel beginning from Jerusalem and going forth into the whole world. But it's not just a kind of theological point. In Luke, there may also be a little bit of history, a bit of verisimilitude here, because after all, we know from Paul's letters that followers of Jesus were still in Jerusalem in the 50s and possibly even in the 60s in the first century. So maybe Luke knew that they stuck around in Jerusalem, and that's why he depicts things as having happened there. Well, thanks for listening to this latest episode of the NT Pod, the third of our Passion podcasts. I'll be along soon with the fourth in the series on John's Gospel. You can find me on the web at podacre.blogspot.com. You can find me on iTunes, Duke's iTunes U, or just Google for NT Pod. And you can follow me on Twitter at Goodacre. Thanks again for listening, and I look forward to being with you soon.